out of here by 9 o'clock.
Yeah. We'll stop and sit in
Evening we have, I think, the next program. This is Rocky Hill. I think before we get started, I would like to get a report from some of the committees. I was wondering, Anita, were you ready or not?
Yep, I'm ready.
You're ready. Okay.
The museum's going to open on May 17th, and we would like you to sign either this page and this page, and you don't have to be accurate, but just put your name in for a date. We would like you to host this year on Sunday afternoons. And all those that are hosting, we would like you to come on the 17th. We'll give you some tea and crumpets and tell you what the museum's all about. That will be our opening day. This one is to help us open. Dusters, cleaners, and floor sweepers are required.
We're going to be gone.
Oh, good. All right. This is a great turnout. We're working, so anytime you want to come down on Tuesday mornings, come. Or if you've got another day you'd like to come, let me know, and I'll fit you in. Any skills are gratefully received. We had 18 people in on Tuesday morning, this last Tuesday. I couldn't believe it. Marvelous.
Lita, you had...
Yes, if you please.
I'm still looking for people who would like to help with the education program. We're trying to bring the museum into the schools. I've talked to the principal at Stevens School, and she's extremely anxious to have us come. And if we get enough people to help, we'll try to get into the other schools. We need people who are willing to go into the classroom with supplies and talk about the old-fashioned way of doing things, talk about the museum. The kids love it. We need people to help get displays together, and we need people to help put things away. So we could really have a wonderful program started here and an educational department for this association if we have just a nice group of people who are willing to put a little time in it. And you'd have fun getting into the schools because they really love to have you come.
Thank you. Are there any other committee reports? We do have the nominating committee as one other necessity which we do have to finish this evening.
How are you?
Judy, come here, we'll sit and chat. May coming.
Nomination. Here she is. Rae officer, 1992-93. President, Grace Cohn. Vice President, Roderick Wilscombe. Treasurer, Thomas Schreier. Recording Secretary, Betty Sinclair. Corresponding Secretary, Jane Nash. Recorders, Doris Schreier, Anita Watson. Auditor, Eleanora Chippy. Respectfully submitted, Amy Cook, Mildred Sod, and Ethel Cook.
Thank you, Eartha. Would anybody from the floor have any further nominations?
The chair casts one ballot.
Excuse me, the vote occurs at the next meeting.
Oh, I'm sorry.
This is an announcement of the slate, which is a report which is required by our bylaws. Hearing none, we shall proceed. If we could go to our program now, again, on behalf of the officers, I do welcome you here this evening and hope you enjoy our program and some fellowship. Now, again, we have Rae Ryan and Dudley Cooke who are going to present the program with a reading and some slides of Rocky Hill. And I would also remind you, don't forget our table and chair here in Dow, which I think you'll find quite interesting, and it is a good period piece. Dud, Rae, we're here.
I enjoyed the book, pardon me, A Vanished World, written by Anne Gertrude Sneller so much, it got me thinking about my own childhood in Rocky Hill. I can't believe it, but I shall be 80 next October. Ruth Brooks. My memories of Rocky Hill, 1908 to 1918. Memories from the corner of my mind. I was born in Rocky Hill, October 2nd, 1908, in the Victorian house, built 2 years earlier by my father and grandfather where I now live. The house was heated with stoves. Cooking was done on an iron stove in the winter and an oil stove in summer. We had no bathroom and no electricity. I can remember my mother cleaning and polishing the lamp chimneys every day. The lamps only lighted a small area so that beyond that, the corners of the room were in shadow. When we finally had our house on Riverview, wired for electricity, the first light bulbs were 15 or 25 watt. My mother said they would be strong enough, and the house did seem bright compared to the lamplight. I started out intending to mention only the sounds of my childhood in Rocky Hill that are now lost. The rattle of coal going down a chute into someone's cellar, the lonesome whistle of a train at night, the crowing of roosters and the contented clucking of hens, the clinking of the iceman's empty tongs as he returns to his wagon after a delivery, the clatter of a hay rake being dragged to the meadow, the droning hum of a silo being filled, the crackling and crunching of a trolley car as it passes through town on ice-covered rails, and the clang of the anvil from Cardell's blacksmith shop on Main Street, the deep warning toots of the New York steamboats as they approach the Glastonbury dock to pick up freight, and the loud rumbling of the daily blasting at the quarry. These were all sounds you no longer hear in Rocky Hill. In April 1912, when I was 4 years old, my grandmother Warner, Fanny Wells Warner, died, and we went to live with my grandfather, Edward Warner, in the square tin-roofed house on High Street, now Old Main Street, in the north end of town, and known now by David Filer. Grandfather had built this house, adjacent to the home of my great-grandmother, Melissa Griswold Warner. My father, Newton Wells Warner, was born there and lived there until his marriage. Living in the north end of town in a big old house instead of our small new one was a change. The house in winter was always cold and we had chilblains. For the only period of my life I had a little girl to play with, Ruth Robbins, daughter of Frank and Harriet Robbins. The Frank Robbins family lived a short distance up the road in the former North School building to which Mr. William Robbins had had a second floor added to the brick first floor when the couple was married. Besides our own big yard and hill, we roamed the Robbins' barns and spacious fields that included a brook in the pasture. The trolley tracks were at the far end of the pasture, and we sometimes placed crossed pins on the tracks for the wheels to make scissors of them. It was farther from school and the store, but a pleasant neighborhood for children. The Old Main Street neighborhood. I had written most of this account when I decided to say more about Old Main Street. It is called that because it has many old houses. Out the lane, as we term Parsonage Street, beyond the trolley tracks and the brook, was the home of the Spino family. They had a two-seated wagon with fringe on top, in which they rode to Mass on Sunday. Chapin Avenue was not open to Parsonage Street then, so it was necessary to drive down to the center and up Elm Street to St. James Church, the old church on the hill. As a child, I thought the templed hills in the song America referred to St. James Church. Beyond the Spino home was the extensive farm of William F. Griswold with his 4 daughters and 6 sons. The Griswold farm, Sunny Crest, is now gone with the wind. The first house above Parsonage Street on the lower level was the Georgian house of James Warner, a cousin. His barn was on Parsonage Street, and his land reached to the trolley tracks that ran out the lane and then curved west, roughly where the Silestine Highway is now. We flew kites in his cleared cornfield. Jim had a delightful sense of humor with which he enlivened town meetings. Next to James Warner's house was the long duplex house owned now by Truman Gilbert, then owned by Carl Warner, Jim's son. He lived in the south side summers. The north side was rented property, and when we had been at my grandfather's for about 2 years, Mr. and Mrs. Eugene Grover and their 2 daughters moved in. Mrs. Grover took the place of my lost grandmother. I always called her Mother Grover. Then came the barn and horse sheds of Mr. Blinn, whose name was used to designate this property. It was called the Blinn Place. The horse sheds, although very old, are still there. The apartment complex in Parsons Village is where the fields of James Warner used to be. Next was the Robbins Farm, with the remodeled North School home of Mr. and Mrs. Frank Robbins and their children, Hamlin and Ruth, beyond it. Pardon me. The next house was then the home of a Mr. DeWolf. I think he came from New York, but we really didn't know him. After that were fields, still part of the Robbins Farm, until you reached the big house on the brow of Havens Hill. There were no houses past that one on the south side of Main Street. At the bottom of the hill was Charters Pond, the extensive ice pond and buildings of the Springbrook Ice Company.
Now, this picture was taken during the 1936 flood, but that is not the normal.
Natural ice was an important crop in those days before refrigeration. Every dairy farmer had his own ice pond, and these were the ponds we skated on all winter, except when the ice was being harvested. On our side of the street, High Street branched off in a gradual rise until the houses in the middle, like ours, were at a much greater elevation than those at either end. The first house, now owned by Peter Revel, was owned by Carl Warner and was being remodeled. The next house was the Greek Revival home of Mr. and Mrs. Fred Morton, Ruth Robbins's other grandparents. Mr. Morton had a long beard. Elderly men in those days often had beards, not neatly trimmed chin coverings, but full, heavy beards that reached their chests. James Warner, William Griswold, Grandpa William Robbins, Grandpa Fred Morton, all had long gray beards. Owen Havens, known as Red Oney, had a faded red beard, but it was trimmed, and he looked like King George V. The Morton household at that time consisted of Grandma and Grandpa Morton, Miss Ethel Morton, who helped run the house, Florence, who taught in Hartford, and their granddaughter, Edla Rowe. Florence married a Mr. Bailey soon after that and moved to New Haven. When I was 5, Edla married Albert Griswold and moved out to the 2-family house on Parsonage Street, still owned by Richard Griswold. Next came the gambrel roofed house where my great-grandmother, Melissa Warner, had lived, but owned then by the Schonbrunns, a German family who had left Germany before any of their sons would have to do compulsory military training. Their son Max and Belle Morton were married and lived on Elm Street, and they used to come and visit their parents riding on Max's motorcycle. Robert, aged 4, rode on a carrier behind his father, while Belle and the infant, Frederick, rode in a sidecar. I thought this was thrilling. Next came our house in the middle of that row of houses. My grandfather's land included the hill and back, part of the rocky hill for which the town is named, and extended to the tracks of the Valley Railroad. At the rear of the house were 2 shops. One was a combined woodshed and outhouse. The other was used for storage. There was a large chicken coop and wire yard for the hens, a pig pen, and a corn crib. We had a large barn that was used only to store the then unused wagons, for the horse was gone. The barn also contained the room partitioned off and occupied by Mr. John Tracy, who did chores and worked in the yard and always washed the supper dishes. He was not really a hired man. He earned his own money working at odd jobs for other people. He was a fine, high-principled man and very good to us children. I don't know why he chose that way of life. I have a cup with flowers on it that he gave me, which I cherish in his memory. He stayed at the house as a caretaker after my grandfather's death, and then he got a factory job and returned to Hartford. After the house came out of probate, my father sold it. Several owners later, denuded of the fruit trees and the grove of hardwood trees where my grandmother had started a wildflower garden, it was bought by Herbert Wilcox. The Wilcoxes lived there for many years. Miss Ruth Wilcox was a dedicated worker at the Historical Society's museum and bequeathed to it her valuable collection of salt dishes. The next house north of my grandfather's was the Evans homestead. The residents there were Fred Spencer, a cousin, Mr. Evans, Ray, later our postman, Hazel, who worked at Travelers, and Violet, who kept the house. Violet was a retiring person who was too shy to work outside the home. I always thought William Wordsworth meant her when he wrote, "A violet by the mossy stone, half hidden from the eye." Another daughter, Daisy, had married Adrian Tyler, and they lived up on the side hill in a cottage built while we were at my grandfather's. Their son, Cleon Tyler, still lives in this house. All of the Evans girls were musical. The barn on the Evans place, which was really Fred Spencer's barn that housed his horse and wagon, stood between the house and the small, older house where Julia Warner, widow of another distant cousin, was somehow managing to raise her 4 children. She couldn't have had much money, but all 4 of them had music lessons. Carrie played the piano, Harriet had voice lessons, Albert played the trombone, and Gilson the violin. This house is now the home of the Gilman family. At the northern end of the high road was the sprawling old Raya's Hotel, then occupied by the Marino family, not too long arrived from Italy and regarded by us Yankees as an unknown quality. Raya's had been an important inn in previous years, and its barroom was famous. There were always rumors about the body of a young boy, a bound boy, being beaten to death and secretly buried in the cellar. Back from the road next was a small 2-room cottage where Fred Robbins lived. He always seemed a figure of mystery to me. Why did he live there alone? This small house has since been greatly enlarged. The next house north was the impressive brick Duke of Cumberland Inn, the well with its long, graceful well sweep, where traditionally George Washington had once stopped for a drink of water, and was still used then. John Robbins, his wife and son Richard were living in the house. An older son, I think his name was Walter, had joined the Navy and eventually reached the highest naval office available to a non-com man. A second son, Harold, several years before, had accidentally shot himself in the throat while hunting back of the hill and had died within a few hours. John's wife left him about 2 years after we moved to the neighborhood, and John and Richard then moved into the small house where Fred Robbins used to live. The Duke of Cumberland Inn then became the home of G. Franklin Madison, whose daughter Edith is the Mrs. Leon Foster, who bequeathed a large sum of money to the museum. Ethel Cooke wrote an interesting paper about the Duke of Cumberland Inn several years ago. The Greek Revival House on the hill, with its white columns, owned now by Dr. Zerithis, was the summer home of a Mrs. Burrow, a New York woman who had servants. At the top of the hill on this side of the road was the McCarthy home. Farther down the hill was the large house owned by Owen Havens. Mr. Havens was an important man in those days, a sort of country squire. He drove a smart, shiny carriage in summer and an equally smart sleigh in the winter. A few years later, he married Miss Catherine McCarthy and built a new house next to the old McCarthy home. He and Kate then lived there. When years later Owen Havens took his own life with a shotgun in the bathroom of this new home, The town folk heard about it with shocked disbelief. An official investigation showed that he had made unwise investments and had lost his own money and that of other people's entrusted to him to invest. Below the Havens home was the very old gambrel-roofed house, the oldest in Rocky Hill, built by William Goffe. It was then the home of Max Whalen and his wife and daughter Mary. A public drinking trough for horses was near the road on their land. Mr. William Robbins was still alive. Two other sons, Dick, who was my father's best man, and Dr. Allen Robbins, had gone to Colorado for their health some years before. Mrs. Robbins and their daughters May and Ann, still lived in the big Georgian house. Miss May Robbins was a teacher in Hartford. Miss Ann was already teaching piano pupils, and I remember hearing Ann's pupils doing scales while voice lessons by Hazel Evans echoed across the street. Some years after Mr. Robbins' death, a new house was built east of the farmhouse, and the three Robbins ladies moved into it. Frank and Harriet then moved into the big Robbins house, but there were always rooms there reserved for Miss Sarah Robbins, who was the sister of William. And may I add here that there's a beautiful quilt upstairs now on display, handmade by Miss Sarah Robbins. Doris Hick Robbins, Hamlin's widow, now lives in the house. But the farm is gone. Apartment houses and businesses are where the barns and pastures used to be. Our Hill. I had written about the houses on Old Main Street when I decided to write more fully about Our Hill. Every child in those days knew the sentence, "Our town receives its name from the ridge of trap rock that extends from Goff's Brook to the railroad station." My grandfather Warner owned the hill in back of the house property and also in back of the houses north of ours to a point roughly in back of Julia Warner's home. It extended down through woods to the railroad tracks. In the summer of 1911, a small building was built on the crest of the hill, and a wooden table and benches were built under the huge pig walnut tree that grew there. This shack was equipped with 3 folding cots and chairs. Shelves and big wooden boxes contained the antique ironstone dishes and kitchenware, discarded by my grandmother in favor of more up-to-date things, but real antiques which would be much sought after today. There was a beautiful view from the hill. The trees were not as high as they are now, and to the northwest you could see Hartford with the gold of the Capitol Dome and other buildings. The south end of Hartford was mostly vacant lots then. Below the hill stretched the meadows with the Connecticut River winding its way down to the south and east. We used to watch the New York boats, the Hartford or the Middletown, steam down in the early evening. There was a big bend at one point, so that the boats were going north instead of south for a short distance until the river curved south again. We used to hold picnics on our hill. I remember the huge one we had for the neighborhood when the shack was completed, and we had fresh pineapple, my first taste of this fruit. It was a grand